From Lutheran Republican to Reformed Libertarian by Kerry Baldwin, read by the author. I'm an independent researcher and writer, an education entrepreneur, and co-host of the Reformed Libertarians podcast. I'm principal educator and Socratic guide at Vita Nova Academy of Albuquerque, a learner-driven, mastery-based microschool. My writing, podcasts, and seminars at mereliberty.com focus on challenging prevailing paradigms in politics, theology, and culture from a confessionally reformed biblical and philosophical perspective. Among others, I address such topics as abortion and views of womanhood. Additionally, one of my primary interests is in promoting a reformed view of libertarian anarchism. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a politically and theologically conservative home. I was baptized, catechized, and confirmed in faith at a local Missouri Synod Lutheran, LCMS, church. My mother, raised Irish Catholic, the only person I've known with a BA in home economics, was never interested in politics, but my father was, and his views shaped mine as I grew up. He was a Green Beret Vietnam veteran working for the Federal Department of Energy by the time I was born. He was more or less a constitutionalist, as he understood it, and a registered Republican. His major influences, as I recall, were Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, and to a lesser extent, Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot. I was enamored by my father's sense of patriotism, duty to uphold the Constitution and America's founding principles, and distrust of the government. Among other things, he impressed on me the importance of not working for, or depending upon, the government insofar as it was possible. In my experience, Lutherans don't often have any sort of robust political theology. This may be because their view of God's two kingdoms, in conscience and external matters respectively, tends to separate politics from spiritual concerns. In any case, my parents were actively involved in both the fledgling homeschooling movement and pro-life activism. One of my dad's religious influences at the time was Francis Schaeffer, a Presbyterian minister who promoted the pro-life cause among conservative Protestants. My 3 brothers and I were homeschooled in our younger years before it was legal in New Mexico. We spent many field trips at the state legislature as my and several other parents worked to legalize it, although in later years I attended both Lutheran and government schools. I distinctly recall attending a number of pro-life events with my parents and brothers. What I took away from those experiences at the time were the religious and emotional appeals of the movement. The emotional appeal being the graphic nature of abortion. The main idea was that hearts and minds of those who supported abortion would be changed if they were exposed to the horrific reality of what abortion actually is. The religious appeal, at least among so-called evangelicals, seemed to be that Scripture alone is sufficient and effective to argue against abortion. I later came to the conclusion that, while both appeals have a certain degree of merit, they are ultimately naively reductionistic, and therefore insufficient and ineffective in changing the social, political, and economic facts and beliefs that contribute to the legality and practice of abortion. In 1996, I followed the Clinton versus Dole U.S. presidential election, in which so-called partial birth abortion was specifically at issue. I turned 18 in 1999, just in time to vote in the Bush v. Gore election. Not yet recognizing the political theater that such elections are, I became engrossed in cable news about the drama. Meanwhile, I was enrolled at the University of New Mexico, UNM, in the fall of 1999. I intended to double major in medical lab science and political science because of my support for the pro-life cause. I was strengthened in my understanding that contemporary legal arguments for abortion had no basis in biology, the Constitution, or human rights, and I came to recognize how such arguments were erroneous attempts to separate personhood and rights from being human. While attending UNM, I was exposed to evangelical, non-denominational Baptist beliefs and worship through the Baptist Student Union. Some classmates there tried to persuade me that I wasn't actually a Christian if I didn't have a conscious conversion experience and hadn't been baptized as a professing believer. I was deeply shaken by this and sought out my Lutheran pastor to assuage my anxieties about whether I was saved. My Lutheran pastor did a good job of that. And that's all I wanted for the moment. He also gave me several introductory pamphlets that contrasted Lutheran and typical non-denominational beliefs on baptism and eschatology. It wasn't long before I had more questions. Regrettably, my questions weren't really answered. My pastor was still seeking merely to emotionally reassure me. Not finding the more theologically substantial answers I was then seeking, I eventually became discontent with the LCMS altogether. Over the next year or so, I tried to work full-time while fitting in college courses when I could, without much success. Motivated partly by a misplaced sense of patriotic duty following the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, and partly by the prospect of medical lab education and job experience, I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in the spring of 2003. I also got married that winter. By 2005, I was pregnant and accepted the offer of an honorable discharge. I took that option at 8 months pregnant and came home to New Mexico. While I was pregnant, the baptism question came up again. This time I wanted a more thorough understanding of what Scripture actually teaches. I wanted to be more confident in what I believed. Either I would baptize my infant son in the Lutheran Church, or I would become Baptist, raising my children as Baptists. However, mostly through exposure to the teaching of the Presbyterian minister R.C. Sproul, the next 2 years of study would unexpectedly lead me to the Reformed Presbyterian perspective. By the time I came to the Reformed view of baptism, I had already given birth to my first 2 children, born about a year apart, and I had them baptized in the LCMS in 2007. We were attending a non-denominational church at the time. The church was largely opposed to the Reformed faith, and I didn't yet know of any Reformed or Presbyterian churches in the area to join. 2007 was also the time running up to the 2008 housing crash. The GOP primary was in full swing, and, still a registered Republican, I had the first opportunity to vote in the presidential primary. But there were 13 candidates at one point, and I had no idea how to choose from among them. Knowing what I did about the Constitution, I reviewed its statements about the role of the executive. As I watched debates, heard candidates speak, and read their campaign platforms, I realized that among them all, only Ron Paul paid any attention to the Constitution. Listening to videos by former Libertarian Party presidential candidate Michael Bednarik, I learned more about the Constitution and Bill of Rights. I read Bednarik's book, Good to be King. He explained that property tax was renting from the state property you owned, and that a driver's license was a grant of permission to use your own car. This perspective was paradigm shifting for me. I decided to vote for Ron Paul, but ultimately couldn't. He dropped out before the primaries reached New Mexico. Instead, I voted for Chuck Baldwin, no relation, of the Constitution Party. I voted once more for president in 2012 for Gary Johnson of the Libertarian Party. I haven't voted for a presidential candidate since, though I will still vote on referendums. In the following 4 years, I experienced 2 parallel journeys, one towards full-fledged libertarianism and the other towards full-fledged Reformed theology. In 2012, we left the non-denominational church we had been attending. After considering several supposed Presbyterian congregations, we began attending a small Orthodox Presbyterian church, OPC. That year, I started MereLiberty.com with the goal of challenging the false paradigm of left versus right and of promoting a libertarian perspective. The housing crash and bailouts in 2008, the so-called Affordable Care Act in 2010, Ron Paul's second run for president in 2012, and all the GOP shenanigans increasingly disillusioned and radicalized me. I was primed for anarchism, but couldn't yet make that leap, mostly because of my misunderstanding Romans 13, and not seeing how non-monopolistic polycentric law was supposed to work. It's said that it takes only 6 months to become anarchist once you accept libertarianism. From 2008, it took me 8 more years. In the meantime, I was active in municipal politics, but I was ultimately disillusioned when I realized the city is also run by unelected people, namely the city manager and city attorney. In 2014, my family and I officially became members of the OPC, and by 2015, I completed my Bachelor's of Arts in Philosophy from Arizona State University. During these same years, I came to realize, belatedly, as is all too common among those who are abused, that my husband was abusive towards me and our children, verbally, emotionally, and financially. He never took responsibility or expressed remorse for his mistreatment and fits of rage. When confronted by our pastor, he refused to listen. The elders of our church supported my decision to divorce in 2016. Later that year, in a Reformed Libertarian online discussion group, a friend asked me what my remaining objections were to libertarian anarchism. Before the year was over, I had been introduced to the writings of economists Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. Especially Rothbard's anarchist political philosophy and a better understanding of the confessionally reformed view of Romans 13 resolved my objections. In many ways, my parallel developments in theological and political understanding dovetailed, and I became a convinced reformed libertarian anarchist. My understanding of our God-given self-ownership, property rights, and corresponding obligation of non-aggression resulted in the consistent conclusion that monopoly states are inherent aggressors and so illegitimate. I began to understand more clearly how non-monopolistic civil governance is both prescriptively ordained by God and a realistic possibility, even or especially in sinful human society. At the end of this essay, along with several other resources, is a playlist of episodes addressing our answers to minarchist objections. It explains some of the key points that persuaded me of libertarian anarchism. It wasn't until I became aware of Jeff Durbin, a Baptist pastor, and the abortion abolition movement sometime in 2016, that I would take up the pro-life defense again. I published a libertarian critique of prominent pro-life and pro-choice views. On the pro-life side, I pointed out that the lack of economic understanding contributed to addressing abortion in an overly narrow and reductionistic way. On the pro-choice side, I pointed out that the broader leftist appeal to protecting marginalized groups was fundamentally undermined by their own arguments favoring abortion. In 2019, I published a two-part episode attempting to articulate fetal rights in terms of self-ownership. I was invited to debate Walter Block on his evictionist position at the Soho Forum. In 2020, most states around the world began implementing lockdowns and other disastrous measures in response to COVID. The policies of the New Mexico governor were especially tyrannical in prohibiting gatherings and mandating business closures, masking, and pushing vaccinations. When she could no longer keep people away from church, she mandated worshipers not to sing or take the Lord's Supper. She would make frequent public addresses that were fear-mongering and threatening. The parallels between abusive personal relationships and the inherent tyranny of the state became more apparent than ever. Not only do states depend on aggression, but also mass psychological manipulation and financial control to perpetuate their abuse. That same year, I began collaborating with my co-host, Gregory Baus, on developing the Reformed Libertarians podcast. Recognizing the tremendous need, we committed ourselves to promoting an understanding of libertarian anarchism, grounded in a distinctively Reformed faith and worldview. And by late 2022, we began publishing episodes with the Christians for Liberty Network through the Libertarian Christian Institute. Since 2020, a lot of libertarians I've known online abandoned libertarianism entirely. The lockdowns and other leftist policies in government and its crony institutions were enough for them to oppose non-aggression as a practical principle. They went full post-libertarian and began promoting a statist strategy on behalf of supposed traditional values. They believe their re-embrace of violence and authoritarianism is putting away the childish things of libertarian principles. If anything, such post-libertarians only reveal that they themselves held to certain ideas childishly. However, I remain fully convinced of what we at Reformed Libertarians call the Boiti option. As we explain in Episode 8, the Boiti option is a strategy of the peaceful underthrow of the state. It's an active strategy of educating a critical mass of the population towards withdrawal of compliance with the state's tyranny. A critical mass need not be a majority. It is the smallest number required to sustain a chain reaction. It may be that the promulgation and widespread embrace of Christianity is requisite to achieving a more just and free society, but that will only be hindered and cannot be helped by the use of aggression. In any case, I'm devoted to the propagation of the confessionally reformed faith and church because I'm convinced it's the most faithful expression of biblical Christianity. I also believe Reformed Christianity provides the truest and most robust grounds for understanding all of human life as God has revealed it to be, whether political normativity or how we should oppose abuse in other societal spheres. I pray that others will join us as we promote these things through the Reformed Libertarians podcast. See the written version of this essay at libertarianchristians.com for endnotes with links to further resources. This has been a reading of From Lutheran Republican to Reformed Libertarian by Kerry Baldwin.